Neil, can you tell me about the first time you thought, I'd really like to be a journalist?
Cool, blimey. I honestly can't remember, it's that long ago. As a little kid, and I often tell this story, and maybe it explains a little bit about me, but my parents used to get two things delivered. One was the Daily Express and the other was the Beano. And I can remember being 4, 5 and 6 years old, that little, and I used to pick the Daily Express up and read it rather than the Beano, and it was something I always wanted to do. Alan Wicker was the big man on the television, you know, this is black and white television, prehistoric days. But it was just something about newspapers and writing and picking up something that encapsulated what had gone on. And of course that was a national newspaper, of course, but it gave me an insight into newspapers. It was something I always wanted to do. And then I always started reading, even as I got older, going through sort of up to 10, 11, 12, and then started thinking about school, what do you want to do? Newspapers just had a special magic for me, it really did.
And what was your local paper?
Well, at the time I was born, it was the South Hemsall and Hemsworth Express was our local paper. And then we moved when I was 6 to Doncaster, which at the time was a hotbed of journalism. I mean, we hear the stories of Clarkson and various other people who came out of Doncaster. Doncaster then had 2 evening newspapers. We had the Yorkshire Post in the morning, we had local papers as well for all the little towns knocking about. So, you know, it was a good place to be if you like newspapers, without a shadow of a doubt.
So taking the next step on, you must have been in your teenage years. Do you remember, did you do work experience?
No, I didn't. It wasn't available as far as I was aware. It was just something I was passionate about and something I wanted to do. So I remember, what do you want to be? I want to be a journalist. Being 14, 13, going to see the careers teacher. And I can distinctly remember when I think it would be 14, we were discussing options for O-levels as was. And I said I want to be a journalist and I want to work on newspapers, and oh, you don't want to do that, you don't want to do that, and I never quite fathomed why, but it was sort of seen as, you know, the old trilby and snide occupation to have, but it was something that I wanted to do, and really amazingly they weren't really clued up or helping me, and so I literally went to the local library and looked up journalism and discovered the NCTJ. Which has sort of kept its course through newspapers ever since, and training, and I know it's a private company and all the rest of it, and there have been ups and downs in the way it's gone, but the NCTJ was there. I learned all about it. That's what I wanted to do, get my O-levels. I knew then I'd got to get 2 A-levels, went and applied for college, went up for an interview in Darlington when I think I was probably still 17, waiting, kind of a late birthday, I was sort of, you know, the youngest in the year. And went up to Darlington, sat the exams, did the interviews, and fortunately got a place at Richmond College as was, and I'm sure you know, it's been a hotbed of journalism training in Sheffield for many a year.
So leaping on a bit, first job?
First job, really lucky, South Yorkshire Times, which was my local paper I sort of ended up editing many years later, but I've kept going around in circles on things. Literally went to Sheffield and I'll be honest with you, didn't do particularly well. Loved the writing, loved all the other stuff, the academia bit of it that was there. I got the law, I got the public admin, shorthand I struggled with. One tool I really struggle with, and it's a great tool, you know, one bit of advert, you know, I always tell people, and it's a bit hypocritical, but get that shorthand, it's such a fantastic tool.
But so just to go back another minute, because we're here around 2016, why?
Why shorthand? Because it gives you a record, and it lodges in your brain when you're doing it. It also, if you do it well enough, it becomes automatic, so you're actually listening to what people are saying. I've lost track of the number of times I've seen young journalists getting everything down, everything that's said, but they haven't got a clue what's being said. They're not listening to the context, and context when people are speaking is always important. Inflection is important, so you've got to be aware of what people are saying, why they're saying it, and sometimes, you know, just that look in the eye when they're saying, it'll tell you, no, this ain't necessarily true. Now, if you can be getting your shorthand down and you know what you're doing and you listen to it, then it's there. People might say, well, we've got digital recorders, we've got phones, we've got all that, but my experience, and that's all I can relate to over 30 odd years, everybody I've spoken to who's been good at shorthand, and even those like me who are not that good at it, say it's the best way of doing it. And then when you go back to your transcript, you've got it there, and it just works. And I really think it's hard. Don't get me wrong, it's not easy. It's got easier with different formats. We were doing, I forget what we were doing, but then you got T-Line came in and whatever. But we've been Pitman 2000, I think, is what I tried to get the drabs with, which I did eventually. But you know, it was tough. But I just think it's such a fabulous tool, and it doesn't matter wherever you are. If you've got that skill, you can be on a train, you can be on a bus, you can be walking down the street. You've got a scrap of paper and a pen. You can get an accurate note of what's going on.
Okay, let's get back to the 70s. First, can you remember the first article, or one of the first articles you thought, that is a cracking piece of work that Neil Speight has authored?
No, I remember. I honestly can't remember. I think I can remember a couple of anecdotal stories that tell you about why local newspapers remain important in my view. I started at the South Yorkshire Times. The editor then, one or two people in the industry will remember, well, a great many people in the industry will remember, is a guy called Dick Ridyard. He was a martinet, he had a little cheroot, he was a character who wandered around with braces. He was an extremely, I don't know if charismatic's the right word, but he had a personality about him. He was almost like, what's the name of the guy in Spider-Man who runs the Daily Globe or Planet or whatever it is. You know, he was that sort of a character. He looked a bit like him, really, with the old cheroot going. And he scared the living daylights out of me in a way, but also one of the first jobs he sent me, I think it was my first week there, was to go and cover the local Rotary Club. Can you believe it? Go and cover the local Rotary Club. So I thought I knew everything. Went and sat at the back of the room. They all had their dinner. I think I might have got a bowl of soup or something for my troubles. Went back to the office and thought, right, what was newsworthy in that meeting? And I did more or less one paragraph. Mexborough Rotary Club met at the so-and-so, whatever the pub was, on Tuesday afternoon. 37 members were present. Typed it all up as we did in them days, stuck it on my bit of copy paper and put it in the basket. And a couple of hours later, Speight, get in here! And says, what have I done wrong? Went in the office. I sent you to cover the Rotary Club meeting, says old Dick Ridyard, you know. And I said, yes, sir. And he said, but you haven't mentioned everything that went on and what we're doing and what have you. And I said, well, I didn't think it was particularly newsworthy, Mr. Ridyard. Newsworthy? What do you know about newsworthy? You've been here 2 minutes. And when I look back, the things they did talk about, which were raising money for local charities and doing stuff like this, of course I was very lucky because I was brash and cocky and confident, and I actually said to him without thinking, well, as you were there, why did you need me there? Why didn't you write it yourself? After I was picked off the wall from the verbal blast that I got, the deputy editor, who was a lovely guy called Brian Kelly, got hold of me and just told me a few words in my ear and whatever. But I learned a lesson that never underestimate what you do. And he was bang on, because I go to Rotary Clubs, you know, in the newspapers that I edit, I pay lip service. You can't get that information anywhere else, even on the internet sometimes. And it's about the community, and it's about places where you live, and it's about things that affect local people's lives. And he was bang on, and he was absolutely right to turn me off the strip. The other thing that happened in the first couple of weeks that I was there, and people, even to this day, when I talk to kids, you know, what's the worst story you've ever done? And it was a story that it was horrible. It was a young lady, a young mum. She was a single mum, if memory serves me right, and she'd got twin sons. And sadly, one of the twin sons had got some congenital birth defects and basically was deaf and blind. The other son was absolutely fine. And the twins would get to the crawling about stage probably about 18 months old, and you know, showing what a cruel world it is. The child that had all the facilities died a cot death. So all of a sudden, this story had brought, you got one healthy, great child, not so healthy, but just he couldn't see him, was blind, and had become totally dependent upon his twin brother. And they had tremendous synergy between the two of them, and then of course all of a sudden he was gone, and I got the message, can you go and do this story, this is what's happened. And I have to say, and pardon I was using the language, crapping myself as I walked up the garden path, expecting, you know, what the hell do you do, punch in the face, but it was a job, it was a great story. And the thing that always stuck with me about, when you talk about why a newspaper is important and getting a message across and doing stories in the right way, the woman, I was expecting her to be angry and furious. Why do you want to imp? She says, no, come in, I'll make you a cup of tea. She says, and I was scared to death, I'll be honest with you. And she said, oh, I'm really pleased you've come round because I want to tell everybody about what a wonderful life he had. And she sat down and talked about the tragedy, and I can't think of a worse tragedy, but she also spoke about the joy that child had brought to her and the impact that child or the two children had on her family and friends and whatever. And she made me so welcome. And I learned then about the power of newspapers. It was the fact that the story was going in the South Yorkshire Times was tremendously important to her. Now, of course, times have changed. This was probably 1979. But that's always stuck with me, and to people who are thinking about why would I want to get involved in journalism and what sort of thing would I do, I promise you, once you have an experience like that, that's why you do it.
It's interesting going back to your editor. You called it at one point.
Dick
you referred
Ridger,
him as
yeah.
Sir.
Yeah.
At another point you said Mister.
Yeah.
Do you think that deference and respect has gone?
Deference and respect. It was how it was in then. I mean, and I think it should be there now. It's not necessarily my nature as a, over the years. I mean, I first became an editor, I think 1988, 89. And I've been a deputy editor before that. I don't think I've ever tried to give the impression that people should call me sir, but I'd like to think that whenever I've acted as an editor with the staff, and I've trained a great many staff over the years, I've got a degree of respect for them, and I'm sure there are a lot of people out there that I've worked with that can't stand me, but they may respect me, and the two things are different. You don't have to be liked to be respected for what you do. So I think you respect the office, and certainly Mr. Ridyard, he will always be Mr. Ridyard to me. He'll never be Dick. I was never on those terms with him, and I think it was of its time. There was more, he had his own office. I mean, nowadays most newspapers are open plan. Even editors don't have their own offices in a lot of places. And there was a certain amount of, he made that character. He was Mr. Ridyard. He was the editor of the South Yorkshire Times. He was at the local Rotary Club, and Mrs. Ridyard. It was almost like Captain Mainwaring, the lady who I don't think I ever met her, but I knew there was a Mrs. Ridyard, and occasionally what she did. And that's of its time and what it was. But I think you win respect by what you do, and I'd like to think that as an editor I've trained and helped bring on many people. I mean, Andrew Norfolk, who was the Sunday Times British Journalist of the Year. Andrew was a trainee when I was first editor at Scarborough, and a number of other people have come, and I think hopefully quite a lot of them have picked a little bit out of what I've taught them and what we've done. I think, and it's a respecting, what I always do, because I respect them, and what I've always tried to do as a manager and as an editor is to take away the fear of failure. Now, in a way you could say, well, hang on, you were sort of motivated by the fear of failure with Dick Ridyard and other things like that, and going back to those times, but I think taking away the fear of failure and saying, go and have a go and be strong, then they'll respect you for that, and allowing people to fail is really, really important. Clearly, if somebody fails 10 times in a row, then you've got a problem. But again, anecdotal stories. I remember when I first went to the Scarborough Evening News as editor in '91, and Liz Johnson, who was the news editor then, and I sort of looked at the way the paper was being run, and I said, right, we'll do the classic thing. We'll break it up into districts. We'll send everybody out on the story, out on the patch rather. Forgive me, and they can bring stuff back in that they get that's off the shelf, rather than people just of its community, rather than people just ringing in and we just go in and cherry picking court and council and whatever, which is still massively important. Never underrate court and council. And Liz looked at me and she said, well, send them out. Yeah, but what happens if they don't come back with anything? I said, well, if they do it once, it doesn't matter. If they do it twice, it doesn't matter. By the third or fourth time, we might have a problem. But I'll guarantee you, if they go out on their patches, they will find stuff that interests them. And they'll pick up stones, or they'll uncover stories, or they'll just do simple things like knocking on the door of the church and meeting a local vicar.
What would you say was the trademark of a paper edited by Neil Speight?
I'd like to think it wasn't. I'd like to think it was truthful. I'm sure that I have at times done things that necessarily weren't truthful at the end of the day, but I don't think I've ever knowingly done anything. I don't think I've ever knowingly written a headline that I didn't believe in. Yes, I've got it wrong on occasions. Of course I have. Either in editorials or with news stories or with the angle we take on news stories, but never intentionally so. I've never blown it up. I think telling the truth is really important. Now, of course, one man's truth may be another man's lie, and there is always two sides to every argument. You have to accept that fact that there are two sides to every argument. But I like to think it's a paper that can pick up, and if it's a local paper, they'll find something in it that relates to their lives. And I go back to Court and Council. There was a spell in the 80s, and at the time I was working for EMAP newspapers and its transition parade when it had its massive expansion. And it was all about, we've got to do features, we've got to do, quote, people stories. And so I think the industry lost its way a little bit and stopped concentrating. And they stopped going to court and they stopped going to council. And I think when you lose that connectivity with your local area, I mean, where else are you going to find that information that touches people's lives? You and I have both sat on many hours in council meetings, whether it's planning or ordinary council meetings or in the good old days of committee meetings, when we look at all the things that are there, and all those items on the agenda affect somebody's life, whether it's drains, whether it's street lights, whether it's bins. They're all things that affect, and I've said it now half a dozen times, it affects people's lives. So if you write it up in a clever and intelligent way, witty if you can get something witty out of it, and make it even more interesting, all the better. But if not, just put the salient facts, because where else are people going to get it? How many times do you hear people say, oh, there's a takeaway shop opened, you know, next door to me, I didn't know anything about it, or this has happened and I didn't know anything about it? Well, it's our job as journalists to make sure that the opportunity for them to know about those things is given as broad a base as possible. And it might not be spectacular news, but it's news and it touches people's lives.
And you have paid a great deal of attention to things like planning meetings. Now, 7 o'clock on a wet Thursday night is not everybody's cup of tea, but you would say to anybody, whether they're starting in journalism or they're continuing journalism, you've got to be in there.
Go and sit in a council meeting. I do it all the time. Go and sit in a council meeting and just listen and read the agendas. And I mean, we talk about witty and Clement. You and I again know. I mean, you know, councillors being councillors, there's always characters in there, and you'll always get that little bit of embroidery of colour and personality that you can weave into the stories. And you'll always get the ones who play to the media if they know you're there, and they'll drop you the lines that you know you're waiting for, and they know you're waiting for them, and your headline is done. Now, the argument is that I talked about truth. Is that truth or is that people playing it? Well, as long as it's honestly said and you're reporting what was honestly said, then I've got no problem with that at all. And if we want to enhance the personality of local people or councillors or officers, even if it is officers, then so be it. What's wrong with that?
But these are changing times now, aren't they? And do you feel uncomfortable or mourn the way, you know, it doesn't seem like a week goes by without an editor leaving a paper to concentrate on other opportunities?
And yeah, very much so. I think a lot of people, the passion has drained away through accountancy and the things that I mean. I see no reason, even today, even with all the other media platforms that are available, I still see that there is a need, for example, for print journalism and newspapers, provided, and I hate to use that word product in a way, but provided the product is right, provided the content is good, then people will come and get it. You've got to know your audience, you've got to tailor for the audience that you're aiming at, but it's there. But the problem is that so many of our newspaper groups now have become so big, and they're driven by, you know, accountants. I mean, I worked for NewsQuest for many a year, well, not many, about 6 years down here in Thurrock, and we got to a point in 2008 where we had probably the most successful newspaper in the country in terms of profit to turnover. We were making them 40% profit to turnover, making them a lot of money. It's around about £1.4 million profit from a little place like Grays. Other parts of the business were struggling, but instead of concentrating on our model and doing what we did, the catch-all edict came out from head office. Everybody's got to lose staff numbers, circulation's got to go down, and they didn't bring in, to my mind, they didn't look at what they were destroying, and they chopped away and made it very, very difficult. And at the end of the day, as an editor, you have to believe in corporate responsibility. Now, I didn't believe in the message that the corporation was putting out, and so at the end of the day, I literally, you know, I have got a few principles, and I left because I said, no, you can't do this. And it's not only is it wrong, it's stupid. But do it they did, and so I walked away. And it was a great shame because I felt we'd got a really good paper going, and that was a paper that was winning industry awards. And I went on to work for another newspaper, and in turn we won industry awards. So I'd like to think that at least my peers, or journalism peers, know that I'm getting something right.
So what about those people who may be at university or leaving university or thinking of journalism? What's your advice to them? What are your hopes for them?
Hopes is that they enjoy their work. I know that's trite and it's off the tongue, but it's true, because if you don't enjoy it, there's no point in doing it. And probably journalism as much, or if not more so, than any other profession. And it's something that you can be. You know, every day is different. Every day is what you make it. It isn't boring. You know, and you might say, well, you just talked about council meetings, you've talked about sitting in court. That doesn't sound, but it is fascinating because it's about people. People will make the world go round. And if you're doing your job right, you relate everything to people. So it's fascinating and it's interesting. But you've got to understand what you're getting into. You know, these days it is difficult. The money is rubbish when you start, across the board. And I've had the really difficult position of having to say to some young people, you know, come and work for me for 2 years, the pay's absolute garbage. I'll try and get you a few holiday reviews to embroider it, because we get a few little bits thrown in, you know, we can have a beer every now and again, we can do this. I'm not going to clock watch. You know, you can run your own diary and have a life as well as work, because I want you to enjoy it. It'll be rubbish money for a couple of years, but you'll learn everything that you need and you'll go on in the industry. And I'd like to think that across the country there are quite a few people that have had that start with me. I've been honest with them, they've learned the skills, I've given them the opportunity to fail, and they've all succeeded, virtually all succeeded, and so they've gone on and had careers. And the beauty is, if you get all those basic skills, and that's why I say a local newspaper is a great place to get them, you can then go and specialise. And I know guys who've gone on, they're working for Sky, they're working for, as Andrew is, you know, the top newspaper in the country, one of the top journalists in the country. There are other people who've found their little niche. I love regional newspapers. I love being a part of the community. It's a privilege and an honour to be a newspaper editor. It really is. Because, you know, if you work for a newspaper, like for example when I was at Rotary Club, 130 years of history was handed to me, carry on this baton. And I think that's really good. And so I've managed to work up from being a junior reporter through being I got into sport. People said, what are you doing in sport? Whatever. I enjoyed sport, really love sport. We're there at East Thurrock United Football Club, where I'm involved as part of that community as secretary of the football club. Love me sport. I then went back into news, I got into management. I learned the stuff that you have to learn in management about the finances and stuff like that, and how to do a spreadsheet and a budget and all that nonsense. But it has to be done, of course, if you want to do it right. But at the end of the day, it's still about writing stories, talking about people, recalling what's happening for posterity. And there's, when I always go and I do lots of talks to WIs and people like that, and I always talk about the old hatch, match and dispatch. You know, when you get the people in the room and they were all born and they were in their local paper, and when they got married they were in the local paper, and as I always say, and hopefully in a long time, ladies and gentlemen, you'll go in there when you pass on. And it's true, and these local newspapers across the country have kept that, and you don't get that anywhere else. You really don't, you know. And it's special. People will say, "Oh, I've got to get it in the paper," and people, you know, come on, you've got to. You know, little Johnny wins the 400 metres at school. They want to see it in the paper. You know, I once scored. There was a highlight of my cricket career. I once scored 49 runs. I've still got the cutting. Speight opened the bat in 49 runs. I've still got it in paper. You know, fantastic. And that, I smile at it, but it's about life. Being a journalist, it's about being involved, it's about recording stuff, it's also about doing good. And again, that's a trite thing to say, but you can make a difference. A good journalist can stop something bad happening. Really can. You've done it, I've done it, and you can make other things happen. And you know, some things that become immensely rewarding. I mean, I organised, as you know, the funeral for the old guy who died at home, who was a war hero. I've done other things. Probably not as publicity as that, but you get an immense feeling of satisfaction when you change something for the better. And being a good journalist allows you the opportunity to change something for the better. And how many jobs of that